Morning, everyone. So we're going to begin this morning's reflection with a little time of discussion. Somebody will say, oh no, and someone will say, oh great. Well, so I'd like you just to gather into groups of 5 or 6. You can turn your chairs around, that's why we have chairs, so that we can move them around, and get yourselves into a little circle, and I'd like you to discuss and think about the following questions. When bad things happen, what do we expect or ask of God? And then, when you think about that, what does this tell us about what we think about God? And then what happens when God doesn't act as we have asked or expected? Just something light for you to think about this morning. So if you'd like to gather yourselves into little groups and have a think about these questions. Okay, just one more minute. Okay, if you'd like to draw your conversations to a close. Well, it sounds like you all had a great time. Maybe we should just continue the conversation. And I'll not say anything at all. That's great. Thank you very much for participating in that. So, any response? When bad things happen, what do we expect or ask of God? Anybody like to share anything about what you talked about in your groups? This is where everybody goes quiet. Absolutely. Some terrible things can happen, and we know people in our congregation have experienced terrible things. So what is it that we ask of God in these times? What kinds of things do we ask of God? Sorry? We want God to fix it. Absolutely. God is the big, powerful being in the sky. Is he not the one that we can turn to and say, take it all away, or fix it, make it better? So what does that tell us then about what we think of God? We expect God to care. And is that when he doesn't do things If we get to the next question, if he doesn't do what we ask him, does that mean that he doesn't care? Sorry? Yeah, it can feel like that. If we ask God, because we think God is all-powerful, surely he can do whatever he wants, and he can do what we ask of him. And we think that if he does, then it shows that he cares. But if he doesn't, then it maybe feels like he doesn't care. And what's the point of having a God who can do all of these wonderful things if he doesn't do them when we ask them of him? It's a real predicament. And of course, it's not new. Humanity has been facing this question for centuries. A number of years ago, I used to mark GCSE Philosophy of Religion exam papers written by 16-year-olds. And I know none of us have our ideas fully formed when we're 16, but I'd like to read some of the answers that they gave. And it was very clear that they had been taught certain things about Christianity, which were reflected in their answers, and many of them answered very well. But sometimes it was pretty obvious that they hadn't really listened in the class and that they hadn't really done any study for the exam. So here's a sample of some of the answers that I found to be pretty interesting. So there was a question, nearly always a question about a just war. What is a just war? And here are a couple of the answers. So the first one is this one. The parable of Noah and the ark shows that God was punishing bad people. The parable was told by Jesus and highlighted that God is omniboliviant. Now, if you can tell me what that word means, I would be very grateful. They loved using all of these big words, which they'd obviously learned in class, like omnipresent, benevolent, and omniscient, and very often mixed up the meanings. And here I love it that the student has put the meaning in brackets, just in case the tutor who was marking it wasn't quite sure what they were meaning. And the word for all-powerful is certainly not omniboliviant. Here's the next one. In the Old Testament of the Bible, there are several examples of just wars where knights fight on behalf of God to try and free the world of sin. That's great, mixing up the history a little bit there. Then there was a question very often about fertility treatment. And so this is what one student wrote. This means it is God's choice whether or not a baby is to be born with a family. They also believe it is better not to be born. As the Bible says, there are none so lucky as those who haven't been born. This means if babies aren't meant to be born, then it's better for them. So there you go. Some interesting philosophy there. And then there was a question, life and death are God's decisions. Discuss. And here are a couple of the answers. In my opinion, I think that God doesn't make your decisions. You do. It's your life, and you can do what the hell you want when it comes to life and death decisions. Just make sure you choose the right decision. And then here's another one. I agree with this quote because at the end of the day, if you have a good life, then there's no point in throwing it all away. So you should live your life and have fun when the fun times are there. And when the bad times come along, build your bridge and get over it before it collapses again. If you have a horrible life and you know or think that your life isn't worth spitting on, then you need to stand on your own 2 feet and start working on rebuilding your bridge because winners never quit and quitters never win. Not brilliant philosophy of life. Where did these young people get their ideas about God? Well, they obviously didn't get it from their teachers, but the world around them, maybe what things that their parents had said, slogans that they've heard, quitters never win, or winners never quit, that kind of stuff. Maybe in the classroom, or maybe even in some kind of a religious setting, they have taken things in and it has all become a bit mixed and mashed up together. So even with the best of teachers and with all the knowledge available to them, these young people had come up with their own answers under the pressure of the exam room. And of course, there's a serious point to all of this. The people of Israel and Judah had received special revelations from God as to what he was like, what he had promised to do, and what he expected of them in the covenant relationship that they had agreed to. They had teachers and spiritual guides who would help them in their understanding of how they were to live and how they were to understand what God wanted of them. And then they had prophets to warn them when they were straying from the path that they had promised to walk in their covenant relationship. They had the writings of the people of the past, the Psalms and the Proverbs, which gave them their words for worship and their path to wisdom in living a life that would be approved by God. And yet, like most of us, even when we've had the best of instruction and the best of resources available to us, we sometimes just choose to listen to someone else or make decisions based on what we think is best or what suits us. Now, when Jeremiah began his ministry as a prophet, it was clear to him that the spiritual life of the nation of Judah was pretty far from what they had agreed to when God had asked them, "Do you want to be my people?" And so Jeremiah's ministry was to warn the people that just as God had promised good consequences when they lived according to the way that they had agreed, he had also promised unhappy consequences when they didn't. And so Jeremiah warns them that the effect of these consequences would be felt by the whole nation. For a great northern power would come and take over their nation, and they would be taken away from the land that God had given them. But then something happened that looked like it would make Jeremiah's prophecy redundant. During the reign of King Josiah, a copy of the scroll with the agreement between God and Israel was rediscovered. And it shows us how far they've come from their agreement with God, and that they didn't even have an extant version of this agreement around anymore. And so when it was discovered, this was a huge discovery, and a great reformation took place. Josiah set about removing all the places of worship to other gods throughout the country. He has the book of the agreement read out to the people on their commitment to God. He restores the work of the rituals of the temple to their central place in religious worship and leads the nation in a return to the life of the covenant. And so the threat of unhappy consequences seems to fade, and the people feel that things will all be fine. But as with us human beings, it's easy for us to miss the point. In all their reforming of the rituals and sacrifices, they lost the sight of the purpose of it all. All of these things were there to help guide them in a life of commitment to God, a life that was lived out in certain actions and behaviours. But instead, they ended up thinking that as long as they did all the required rituals and exercises, then God would be happy and they could live as they wished, and things would just be fine. They put their trust in the rituals of the temple and the external requirements of their religion, but they didn't see the need to change their own hearts or their way of life. And Jeremiah notices this. And so he warns the people again that despite their adherence to all the temple rituals, they are not living as God has required of them and as they had promised. The Reformation was only on the surface, and there was no real change of heart. And so Jeremiah warns that the temple will be taken away from them, that their religious rituals would come to an end, and even their security in the land would be lost. But Jeremiah's message is not welcome, and there were many who refused to listen to him. And there were other prophets who said exactly the opposite, that God would indeed look after his people, just as he had in the past. But Jeremiah's prophecy came true, and the temple was not quite destroyed, but certainly desecrated, and things were taken from it. And then the wealthy and the elite and the educated and the gifted were taken away from the land. What were the people to do? Who were they to listen to? Their temple songs were full of references about how God had delivered them from their enemies in all kinds of miraculous ways. Even when in the past they had made mistakes, and yes, they had suffered the consequences, even then God had always forgiven them, and God even had a record of miraculously delivering them from the consequences of their own actions. Surely God wouldn't let them experience such disasters. It wouldn't even be good for his reputation. They had felt that as long as they kept fulfilling the ritual and sacrificial requirements that God had put in place, then surely God would look after them Was Jerusalem not his own holy city? I wonder, when they had gone to the temple to worship, did they only sing those psalms that recorded and reminded them of God's mighty actions of power and delivery, such as Psalm 136? God alone does great wonders, the leader would say, and they would sing back, for the steadfast love of God endures forever. With a strong hand and an outstretched hand, he divided the Red Sea, for his steadfast love endures forever. He led us through the wilderness, for his steadfast love endures forever. Over and over affirming the great and miraculous works that God had done on their behalf. But I wonder, did they avoid the songs of the Psalms where it talked about the need for repentance and forgiveness and seeking God? Unfortunately for the people, Jeremiah was the prophet who was proved to be right. The Neo-Babylonian Empire of the North, a center of great civilization and wealth, military power, and a desire for conquest, overran the area of the Middle East, causing great destruction in Jerusalem and the country of Judah. And as we said, all the educated and wealthy of the country were taken captive and relocated to Babylon. For those who had been so suddenly taken away, it was a traumatic experience, as we talked about in the children's talk this morning. Their country, their independence, their religious center and institution, their families, everything they held dear was taken away from them. Their whole lives were uprooted, and they found themselves in a foreign country with different rules, different cultures, and different gods. And left back in Jerusalem was a remnant of people who were now under the rule of a king who had been put in place by Nebuchadnezzar, and who ruled on his behalf in this part of the empire. And the people of Judah, both those who had been taken into exile and also those left behind in the land, they were distraught. How had this happened? Hadn't they done everything they should have? How could God desert the city of Jerusalem, the place on earth where his presence dwelt? What were they to do? Where was God in all of this? And as before, in the time of their distress, they looked to their prophets for a word from the Lord. And there were some prophets who were giving the people what they claimed was a message from God. Their message was, don't submit to this. God is not finished yet, for he's going to bring back the holy vessels which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple when he first attacked the city. Their message was that this difficult period was merely a moment of discomfort, one that would soon be put behind them. And one prophet who spoke this message to the king was a man called Hananiah. And he claimed that God has already broken the control of Nebuchadnezzar. Within 2 years, God will bring back all of these holy vessels. He will bring back our king and all of those who have been taken into captivity. How hopeful that message must have sounded. Not just to those still in Jerusalem, but even more so when it reached the ears of those struggling in exile in Babylon. Surely God would not leave them as captives in a foreign land. Surely he would deliver them as he had many times before. Did they not have a miracle-working God? And I'm sure when they heard this message, they thought, let's not get too settled here in Babylon. Let's just wait this out, and soon we'll be back in our homeland again. Now, Jeremiah was one of those who was not taken to Babylon, but he remained in Judah in the court of the puppet king Zedekiah. And Jeremiah received a message from God that he took to the king and gave to the people. God told Jeremiah to put on a wooden yoke, like those used to keep the cattle in place as they worked the fields. And Jeremiah was to go and take this message to the king and to the people. This yoke, he said, is a symbol of the yoke of the rule of Babylon. And they were to accept this yoke as part of their lives at this time. Now, Hananiah, of course, refuted everything that Jeremiah had said. He took the wooden yoke off Jeremiah and he smashed it on the floor and he said, this is what God is going to do to the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar. But Jeremiah remained steadfast in his message. And he said, how wonderful that would be. Would that it were true, that God would validate your words by doing these things. But listen to me, Jeremiah said. The job of the prophets throughout our history has been to warn you of impending disaster when you are going wrong. And this is God's message. Hananiah, God never sent you. You've talked this whole country into believing a pack of lies. And so God says this, you claim to be sent by God? Well, I'm sending you all right off to exile. And you, Hananiah, you will be dead within a year. What a conflict between two people who claim to speak for God. And as well as speaking to the people left behind in Judah, Jeremiah also sent a letter to all of those who were already in exile. And this is what he told them from our reading this morning. And it's in the artwork that we see from the series of pictures. He says, settle in where you are. Build houses and make yourselves at home. Put in gardens and eat what you grow. Marry and have children. Encourage your children to marry and have their own children, so you will thrive in this country and not waste away. Make yourselves at home there, and rather than protesting against the country that has taken you captive, work for its well-being. Pray for your neighbours in Babylon, for if things go well for Babylon, they will go well for you. Who were they to believe? One day they were being told they would be home in 2 years, and now suddenly they are told you're going to be here for 70 years. Settle in and make the best of it. And if they were to stay in this land and live with the circumstances they had, what did that say about their belief that their God was a God of miracles? A God who would deliver them in times of distress? Were those psalms no longer true, no longer relevant? How could they sing praises to God when they were in a strange land, when they were not free, when no one around them believed in their God and would probably laugh if they told them what they thought about their God, if they sang such songs of deliverance and miracles? Your God, a God of miracles? I don't think so, they would say. Where is he now? Your God will deliver you? I don't think so. We are the ones with the power and the military might. But as it turned out, Jeremiah's prophecy was the one that came true. In less than a year, Hananiah was dead, an endorsement of the message that Jeremiah had brought. And we know that the people did settle in this land of Babylon. Some of them even became important leaders in the country with positions of influence, such as we read in the stories of Daniel and his companions. But we also know that it was during this time that they began to rethink and re-examine their understanding of God, with Jeremiah being the first one to start them on this journey. And the fact that they remained in exile for 70 years allowed time for new truths about God to be learned. In this part of their spiritual journey, they found themselves to be in a place that was uncomfortable, a place that was alien, a place where they felt bereft. But in this place, they were to learn so much more about their God. Here are some of the things that the people of Israel and Judah learned in the next few decades. They learned that just because God is not visible, it does not mean that he is not present and engaged. God is always working his purposes out, even when we can't see anything happening. They learned that God is not bound by the present moment of crisis, and he only acts in times of emergency. Rather, God is acting in faithful sovereignty over the long haul, for the well-being of those that he cares for. They learned that God's intent toward Israel is always positive and always at work and will always prevail, even in times of desperation and even when the circumstances offer a very different narrative. They were to learn that the temple and all its ritual were helpful but not necessary for a relationship with their God Yahweh. Jeremiah himself was to tell the people that the external forms of religion are meaningless unless they contribute towards helping us change what is happening internally. And they learned, yes, that God could be worshipped in a strange land without of any of the normal help that they had in their religious life. None of the external factors or rites or rituals that they were used to. For true religion requires a change of heart, which leads to a change of life. They learned that even though exile was a reality, and disastrous though it might seem, they would survive. They would be compelled to find new ways of being the people of God in a time of exile. They learned that even when catastrophe happens, we can allow ourselves to be reformed, for our thinking to be transformed, and for our understanding of God to be transfigured, so that we can see God for who he is and not as we imagine or wish him to be. So Jeremiah's message to the people in exile was this: make your peace with where you are. You cannot go back to the past. But there is something new for you if you are willing to travel this past and seek the future that is yours. Our understanding of God is always incomplete and often filled with error. And so we often need to go through a time of finding our understanding of God challenged and realizing that there is still much about God to be learned. But if we continue to ask God to take away all the difficult things in life, to deliver us from anything that makes us hurt or uncomfortable, then we miss out on learning these things and on a deeper relationship that God wishes to have with us. Our understanding of God needs to be unraveled, and that's our theme over these weeks. And it's sometimes life feels like it is unraveled, but sometimes we need to do some unraveling of our thoughts about God so that we can learn something new. But this is difficult and uncomfortable for us, just as it was for the people of Judah. Over these past weeks, we've been taking strips of ribbon and writing on them prayers or thoughts that have come to our minds as we have considered this theme of unraveled. And you'll find there are 6 baskets of ribbons around the room. There should be one near you. And I'd like you just to take a couple of minutes if you want to think of a prayer for understanding if you are going through a time of difficulty, or a prayer of thanksgiving if you have gone through a time of difficulty and have learned much about God in that time, or a prayer for someone you know who's going through a hard time and needs to understand God in a new way. We're just going to take a few minutes of quietness, and if you'd like to find the basket near you and take a ribbon, and there are some pens in the basket, and write a prayer on the ribbon that you would like to pray this morning. So if somebody near the baskets would just hold them up so that people can see where they are, and people can go and take a ribbon and write a prayer on it. When you've finished writing your prayer in the ribbon, you can just put it back into the basket, and these will be woven into our wheels at the front here over the next week. The artist who painted the picture for today's reflection says this: Jeremiah tells them to stay, plant gardens, and allow their families to flourish in this strange land. I'm sure this was disappointing, but when you hold on to the past, you miss the richness of the present and the future. Maybe when our lives unravel in transition, the loose end of our dreams, the friends we leave behind, and the paths untravelled can become the roots that stabilise us in the new place where we find ourselves. These threads can create grounding that nourishes and transforms us into something new. This new place can be a gift, a place of flourishing. Amen.